My name is Lisa Escobedo. I am the director of the National Census Program at the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials Educational Fund. I know that's a handful. We're also known as NALEO Educational Fund. You can just call us that. And so, as folks know, some of the major challenges that we've had in terms of counting our Latino community has been around this ongoing kind of battle to make sure that the citizenship question was removed. But in the process, a lot of damage was done. And so I want to talk a little bit about how we've prepared at NALEO, some of the things to think about. We're going to, I'm going to present for about 15 minutes, and then we're going to have kind of an open discussion. I'll be able to answer some questions. So as you think of questions, make sure to jot them down. Great. So what made the citizenship question so important for Latinos? So no other issue before the courts would have more direct consequences for the nation's Latinos. We like to think about the Latino population not just as a minority group, but we are the second largest population in the country. And so as Latinos go, so does the country. So it was a major issue for our community. Question raised concerns in all households, native and foreign-born, about the confidentiality of information provided to the government. Based on the research that we've recently done, this was actually not just an issue for a lot of your undocumented communities only, or for undocumented peoples only. It actually became an issue for all Latinos. We have a lot of mixed status households. Most of our households are mixed status. So when we looked at both foreign-born and native-born, it was an issue for the Latino community in general. Census officials estimate that about 6.5 million residents would not have responded to the questionnaire and would have driven lower response rates if the citizenship question would have been included. In a survey conducted by us in NALEO Educational Fund, 78% of Latinos stated that the inclusion of the citizenship question would make people afraid to participate in the Census 2020. So while the citizenship question, I'll reiterate that, the citizenship question will not be on. Interestingly, in the recent focus groups that we've done, there's a huge, about 50% of the people that were in the room thought the citizenship question was still going to be on. So one, it's making sure that people know that it will no longer be on, but also understanding that in the process of this battle, the news attention it received, the media attention among Spanish language media specifically, really kind of generated this sense of fear and this sense of thinking that the citizenship question will be on. And we haven't received as much promotion and as much information on the fact that the citizenship question will no longer be on. So the effects remain there. Sorry, I'm having issues with my clicker here. So how can we actually pulled together, this was a result of some of the work that we did across the country, where we actually hosted listening sessions with some of our, what we called NALEO census commissioners, which were some of the Latino elected officials across the country. We listened into what organizations had to say. We listened into recommendations from organizations, and we compiled a set of recommendations on and this was actually submitted to the U.S. Census Bureau on what the Bureau can do now in a post-citizenship question phase. Making final preparations for self-response by paper and online and by phone. As you all know, the Bureau is preparing for that now. But making sure that all the systems are in place and ready to go is going to be key. As we know, this is going to be one of the first online census. It will not just be online. There's going to be different ways for folks to respond, but making sure that there's no huge hiccups and issues as they implement the work. Launching a comprehensive partnership and communications plan will be key. So we also made that recommendation to the Bureau. What folks should know, though, is that while the Bureau is investing a significant amount of money in ads and getting the message out there through various news sources, it will not be focusing on this particular message of the citizenship question will not be on. This issue is kind of left onto us as providers and as service providers. Most of the commercials and kind of PSAs and marketing plan will be focused on general information around the census, what will be on, who should get counted. The PSAs are great, they just released them, but it will not specifically hone in on the issue of the citizenship question. We want to make sure that the Census Bureau puts its information technology systems in place. Again, folks remember what happened with the ACA. I don't know if folks remember and what happened when it went online. There's a huge crash. And so we want to make sure that this doesn't happen with this census. And we want to make sure that those systems have been tested. So we've been actively communicating with the Bureau and working with the Bureau's kind of technology committee to make sure that everything is in place. Fully developing its field presence for questionnaire assistance and follow-up with residents who do not initially respond to the questionnaire. So again, this is a major issue because not only did we have this fight around the citizenship question, there are less partnership specialists than in 2020. There are less field operations. There was about 500 field offices for the Census Bureau in 2010. Now it's about 248. And there's kind of less presence overall in terms of making sure that the Bureau, in 2010 when we did the census work, the partnership specialists in the Bureau were everywhere. So they became trusted faces and trusted sources. Now we have less of that. And so we want to make sure that they receive the appropriate funding to continue that work, but to increase it. The other things folks should know that we need to prepare for on a post-citizenship question era is the fact that we will not have brick and mortar questionnaire assistance centers like we did in 2010, where we can all participate as questionnaire assistance center. The libraries would do that, and the Census Bureau had designated QACs. More than likely now they will move into mobile response units, which means that they'll make themselves available for assistance at community fairs, at events. They're going to be mobile, which presents some opportunities, but also some challenges, again, because there will not be that kind of go-to that we had in 2010, and we're facing many more challenges than we had in 2010. There cannot be any further delays in these activities, and it is particularly critical that Congress ensures a robust fiscal year 2020 funding for the Census 2020. So, as NALEO, when we look at census operations and what we need to do in this moment when we have all of these challenges with fear, lack of confidence in the administration and the Department of Commerce, we also look at what is the infrastructure and what are the needs to make sure that the Census Bureau executes its work appropriately. The Census Bureau is not appropriately funded right now to execute the work that we envision. I believe the QACs and the mobile response initiative that I just mentioned is not appropriately funded. There is still conversations around appropriations to making sure that we figure out how this $2 billion funding gap for the Bureau is going to be resolved between now and November 21st. So when we look at this post-citizenship question era, again, we don't just think about how do we gain the confidence in amongst communities, but how do we make sure that we have an infrastructure that works for our communities? So community education, information, and reporting will be key. And I'll draw your attention to reporting because I'm sure folks are wondering what that means. And so some of the work that we have to make sure and do is when the Census Bureau conducts non-response follow-up to households that do not self-respond, this means an enumerator will call or visit households. So we, as trusted messengers, need to make sure that we relay this information to our communities. For the past year or so, we've seen an increase in very public raids under this administration. We've seen a very anti-Latino, anti-immigrant rhetoric. And so there is not that much trust in our communities. And so on one end, under kind of our immigrant rights workshops and our Know Your Rights workshop, we're saying don't open the door to anyone. And then we're saying, oh, wait a minute, but in May, there's gonna come, some enumerators might come knocking on your door. So do open the door, but just make sure that it's an enumerator, right? ICE has a federal badge, an enumerator has a federal badge. So we need to make sure that we plan accordingly for how we relay this information. What we're saying as NALEO is we're saying try to self-respond by April 30th, 2020 to avoid as much as possible anyone to come and knock on your doors. We know that in terms of the Latino community, they actually find that as an inconvenience, anyone knocking on their door, based on the focus group that we did. So remind them to self-respond. The best way, again, to avoid a census enumerator coming to your house or calling you is by responding by April 30th. So that is the message we're telling our community. If one or more questions on the census questionnaire is left blank, the Census Bureau says that it increases the likelihood that it will attempt a secondary contact. So again, more important information: to avoid a knock, to avoid a call, make sure that you respond by April 30th, 2020, and that you respond with as much information as possible. On our end, as NALEO and as organizations, we want to make sure that we work to educate the community about details of the non-response follow-up and assistance guidelines. So again, one of the things that we talked about in the previous panel was the importance of making sure that we as trusted voices were providing accurate information to our communities, making sure that they understood when an enumerator goes out, what triggers an enumerator, and how to avoid an enumerator if they don't want that interaction with the federal government. The other piece that we talked about is making sure that our community understands what will and will not be on the census form. The census form will not ask about immigration status. It will not ask about citizenship. It won't ask you for your bank account number. It will ask you for your name. It will ask you for your birthday and whether you rent, own, or just live in the household. So these are all really key important pieces to make sure that as we're trying to gain the trust of our community, we can also provide them accurate information on what the census is and isn't. In the lead up to 2020 census, our national bilingual hotline 877 and Censo served as a trusted resource. So one of the things that we're doing to prepare in this post-citizenship question era is that we went from planning our hotline as an informational hotline, which is again 877 and Censo, to actually serve as a census protection hotline. Our hotline will be has partnered with the Lawyers Committee, with the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund, to make sure that as we're flagging issues in the field or issues of fear, as we're flagging any potential even raids, that we're making sure that folks have a way to report it into our hotline and that we can do something about it and take action, work with the state attorney generals, et cetera. But this hotline is live now. We initially planned the launch date for our hotline as January 2020. And then we just kept seeing this news cycle around the citizenship question and the fear and the questions and more questions. And we needed to make sure that our community had a vehicle to get in touch with us. So we went from a January launch to a June 24th, 2019 launch. Just many sleepless nights for me, but our hotline is completely live. If folks want to report anybody going out into their community, asking for their bank account, asking for their immigration status, folks should feel encouraged to call us to this hotline. We do have actively a reporting mechanism, and we work in partnership with our legal organizations. It will be something more formalized as a census protection operation once we go into 2020, but we are live. That's kind of been our kind of bread and butter to prepare for a post-citizenship question era. A rapid response plan will be put in place to address, again, reports of any potential impersonators or misinformation. In the state of California, the legislature actually passed an additional bill to add on additional fines to the existing fines if you act as a census enumerator or impersonate one to try to get information. That's something else that we've encouraged other state legislators to do as well. So again, this kind of became one of our most popular slides in all of our trainings and presentations. It's very important that as we talk about the census and this work, what we've seen is that when we say, hey, the citizenship question will no longer be on, it sometimes raises more questions for our community, especially if someone didn't know that it was ever on the table. Then they say, oh, wait a minute. Maybe I shouldn't feel like, what are you talking about, the citizenship question? So what we've tried to do is combat that misinformation and disinformation with a lot of accurate information. So if nothing else, remember what is on the questionnaire. This is the only things that the census questionnaire will be asking folks, aside from relationship to person one. It's basic information. One of the things that we are seeing, and I will flag for you all, and I don't have the answer yet, is that the question around Hispanic origin is raising a lot of red flags in our community. Because what we've been hearing in our focus groups is specifically Latino millennial men, interestingly, ask why there's a second question aside from race that asks whether they're Hispanic or not. And they see it as, hey, the citizenship question wasn't on, but now there's this one to target us, right? And that's actually not the case. It's very important to inform our community that the Hispanic origin question was actually added in 1970 to the census as a result of a battle of various civil rights groups wanting to make sure that that question is included so that our community, so that data around Hispanics to implement civil rights policies, the Voting Rights Act, et cetera, was enforced. This is something that we fought to get. But right now what we're seeing is in our community, they think that this is another way to target folks. So this is going to be a huge battle, especially for Latino serving organizations, folks who work in hard to count Latino areas. This is going to really be our next battle. Again, what it will not ask, it won't ask for criminal background or convictions. It's not going to ask anything around permits or licensing. You know, can your tia's family live on the garage? That's not what it's going to ask, right? Some people, that's what they're afraid of, and so making sure that our community understands that. So to decrease the likelihood of anyone knocking on folks' door, fill it out early and soon. If they can online, even better. An enumerator, this is, again, what we've been seeing in some of the areas where we're organizing, specifically in Central Valley, California, is that organizations are actually including this information as part of your immigration know your rights workshops, where they're saying, what will an enumerator ask and not ask, one, but two, what will an enumerator do and look like? One, an enumerator will never ask to enter your home. Two, they will identify themselves and wear a U.S. Census Bureau badge. Three, they will only ask questions that are on the questionnaire. This means that they will not ask about citizenship or immigration status. Very important. They will never ask you for or request additional documentation. If anyone comes to the door and says, I'm an enumerator, and I want to make sure that you're here documented and I want to see those papers, it's not an enumerator, and that should be reported right away. So we've had to kind of shift how we talk about what will and will not be on the census and information around the census because of these conversations that have been had. But folks should know and understand that every single person in the household must get counted. In our focus groups, actually in our national survey, close to 50% of Latinos thought that people who were undocumented shouldn't be counted. Not because that's how they felt, but it's because of what they heard. Right? So we have to be the folks to inform everyone that everyone in the household should be counted. Now, will a lot of folks not make themselves count? Absolutely. We're living in a tough time. The rhetoric is there, and there's only so much we can do. But can we inform our community of what will be done with their information and what will not? Definitely. One thing that's not on here that folks, I didn't put it on here because I have very few time, and I feel like folks have heard it a lot, is data confidentiality and security. There is a Title 13 on a law on the books that protects people's data confidentiality. Now, can I go and say, I can assure you personally that your aggregate information will not be shared? Probably not. But there is a title on the books. There is a law on the books. Individual information is not shared. If individual information is shared, say I'm an enumerator and I decide like, hey, I want to let somebody know that in this household there's 5 people, that's breaking the law, and there is a fine of up to $250,000 or up to 5 years in jail. I don't know any basic information from what you saw on there that is worth $250,000, at least not mine. And so it's very important to remind the community that there is consequences, there is a way to report it, and that they are protected by law. There is no administration, there is no president that can override that. Now, there is an executive order that folks have probably heard about that the president announced in terms of sharing information across agencies. This is a very complex topic. It does have to do with the data that the federal government will share with the states for the sake of redistricting and whether they're going to share citizenship data or not. And it does have to do with us organizing our state legislatures to make sure that when they're looking at the citizenship data that the administration provides, that they are not using it to draw districts, because that's not what the Constitution says. But that will be left up to the data and up to we the people, the legislatures, and up to we the people to advocate to make sure that redistricting is done fairly and justly in our states. So the executive order is a whole other, I didn't want to put it up there because I felt like it was going to open a whole other can of worms, but folks should know that that's something that groups are working actively on, and that's going to be a fight that's going to take us well beyond 2020 and 2021. And that is all I have on a post-citizen. There's so much more, but I know my time is limited, and I wanted to give folks time for questions. So I don't know, do we open it up the floor for questions? If you have questions, raise your hand. I believe there's a mic runner right there. Yes.
Are the enumerators mandatory reported if they see abuse with elderly or children?
You said, how do they report if they see it?
They're going to be mandatory report.
From the, you're saying from the enumerator? Not that I know of.
So
Not that I know
see abuse in elderly or children, they want to report.
So the question is, if an enumerator goes to a household and sees any abuse of the elderly or of children, are they mandated to report that? I don't know the answer to that. I want to say no based on just the policy itself and what the enumerator is supposed to do, because they're not supposed to enter the home. But I'd have to get back with you on that, because that might be a Census Bureau question, and I don't want to speak for them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be good to look into it.
Yeah, that's a great question. I hadn't thought about it. Yeah. Any other questions? I think there's some right here.
Hello, Vivian by reporting actually for the Pacific Sentinel. What is Oregon's proactive communication plan for combating disinformation, particularly about the citizenship question and the informal agreement with ICE about staying away from census events?
Can you repeat the question? You're asking specifically about Oregon, right? But repeat your question again,
yes.
And I'll repeat it for folks.
So you've spoken about passive engagement with through NALEO through 1-800-EL-CENSO.
Mm-hmm.
How is your organization, or what is Oregon's plan to proactively combat disinformation campaigns regarding the census?
So I don't know what the state's plan is, but I can give you a kind of national view of how we're working with the different states. I think I met some of the folks from the governor's office, so I got to connect with them. There you go. So in terms of combating disinformation, so there's a couple of things going on right now. The national organization, so there's a national coalition of organizations that represent different communities. We represent the Latinx community. There's the Asian Americans Advancing Justice. There's the Leadership Conference of Civil and Human Rights, et cetera. And so what we're working on is we actually have something called the Disinformation Lab, where we're monitoring any type of disinformation that may be out there, and then we're sharing with the organizations and the groups what information they need to put out in the communities to combat that, right? So one is on the information side. Now, that's gonna be a huge lift for a couple of reasons. One, there's gonna be misinformation that is misinformation on purpose, where someone might wanna purposely tell people that undocumented folks should not be counted. And then there might be misinformation that's not on purpose, that maybe the census is a very complicated issue, right? It's just 10 questions, 10 minutes, but to the operations, there's just so much more. Misinformation can even mean an organization saying, on April 1st, 2020, enumerators will go out into your community to get counted. That's actually not true, right? April 1st, 2020 is census day, enumeration starts in March right? So we have to combat, one, the kind of entities that might do this on purpose. Two, inoculating the misinformation that might be on there out of goodwill, but just lack of information. And then three, on the reporting end, we're working on a couple of things. So one is, yes, reporting it to the Lawyers Committee and to MALDEF, and we're working with Asian Americans Advancing Justice, who also has their legal team. And so a couple of things that we're looking at is, how do we model the election protection model that we have? So we're part of the Election Protection Coalition, where once we flag an election protection issue, we basically have to deploy attorneys into the regional areas, figure out what is the issue. Is this something that could be resolved? Is there something that's going to require litigation? And then how do we work with either the city, county, or the state? For this particular matter, we will also be working with the attorney generals for each state. So we did start engaging in conversations in the state of California with the attorney general, and we're trying to figure out how do we bring on the attorney generals from all of the other different states where there's a huge amount of Latino hard-to-count communities, because that's kind of one of our priority audiences. But the plan is to bring in the attorney generals to this conversation. As we're flagging the issues and where they're coming from, I will say that more than likely the states that we will prioritize in terms of having those conversations will be where we're seeing more of that. The other kind of small slither that we should think about is the fact that when operations start, self-response, non-response, there sometimes are some nuances that have big effects on our community. There might be certain areas where they decide that, hey, internet shouldn't be a first option, paper should be a first option, we should shift that around. And so the way that they receive stuff in the mail might not be the same as what we're saying on TV and telling them, right? And so we need to make all of those rapid response shift. So that's another thing that we're planning for, and that's part of the rapid response that we mentioned. So once we hit the ground in 2020, that's just when the madness starts. There will be a lot, but that's in a nutshell kind of the areas that we're focusing on. There's a tech piece. So there is an effort at the national level with Facebook, Twitter, and Reddit, where they're going to be focusing on how do they flag misinformation on their platforms. We started those conversations with them a while back to hold them accountable and not say, hey, there's just a flat platform where folks post. We don't know what they post. We try to monitor as best we can. Well, we know that that's very hurtful, right, from what we saw in 2016. And so we are actively working with them on figuring out how do we flag those and what are some of the keywords that we'll have to be looking out for. So it's a kind of multi-layered approach. But we're also going to rely on community to report in what they're hearing and seeing, because we won't be able to be everywhere. Yeah.
And if you would yield to a second question, in regards to the executive order, could you elaborate on the threat posed by this attempt to district based on citizenship instead of population?
Yeah, so basically what the initial conversation, and because I'm not a legal expert, there might be things that I don't know, but I'll try to give you the best that I can in terms of summary. So the initial reasoning that the administration had beyond including a citizenship question was for the implementation of the VRA and to make sure that we had accurate and enough data on the citizens of voting age population, right? Knowing how many people are citizens so that when we draw districts, it's based on citizens and not whole populations. Well, we know that directly goes against the Constitution. Right, and so the kind of second way that they saw in trying to do this is looking at records, administrative records, data that they might have from multiple agencies to figure out whether someone's a citizen or not. Right, looking at Social Security information, basically every agency that they have access to figure out whether those folks are citizens or not. One, we're not sure if that information is accurate. Some of those records are old. Two, the other kind of piece of work that they're doing is asking states to also contribute to that data through DMV records. I'm sure folks saw a lot of the news stories around various states saying that they were going to contribute or not. In California, obviously the state is opting to not, so they won't be providing DMV records. It's up to the discretion of the state. So again, now you have another layer of inaccurate information. So that's one piece of it, that you might be working off of very inaccurate data. Two is that we believe that every person should be represented. And so as the Constitution says, to make sure that we draw districts based on the whole persons living in an area and not just citizens, it really is undermining democracy in the Constitution. And so that's how we see it from that perspective. There are kind of some nuances that the legal community is having conversations and discussions about right now. But I will say a good starting point is really advocating at the state level to ask your state whether they are cooperating with the executive order or not, and making sure that they're not. So while we're working on, again, the implementation, doing the outreach, which is all great work, there's a lot of this kind of institutional back-end work that we have to do to make sure that once 2020 passes, that the executive order doesn't also hurt the political power of our community. But again, there's a lot of nuances that someone in the legal community might be able to probably answer a little better, but that's my kind of spiel on it. You're welcome.
I can answer the question on the DMV
data.
There you go. There is a state law that prohibits state and local government from providing immigration data on a person unless there's a very, very narrow set of circumstances, all of which involve criminal activity. So we're not, Oregon's not providing that, and couldn't if it wanted to, without amending the state statute.
Awesome, that's great to hear. I'll check that out. Any other questions? Yep.
Thank you for your presentation, Lizette. It was a complicated topic that's have twists and turns over a long period of time, and thank you for succinctly summarizing what is a very complex issue. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what NALEO's partnership looks like with states in particular in the non-response follow-up phase. So we're, well situated here in Oregon, having state resources that when we get to the point where we move from the response period, self-response, to the non-response follow-up, we, like many other states, will be looking at the census response rates by tract and being able to deploy get out the count efforts in the tracts that are falling behind in terms of response rates. But I'm curious, for states that do not have the resources available for the get out the count and or maybe not as well organized, what's NALEO's approach in terms of partnering with local organizations in those places, particularly for ensuring that the count is as high as and accurate as possible in hard to count tracts, particularly for the Latinx population?
Yeah, so we're doing a couple of different things. And so while our resources are limited and we're actually not a very huge team, like my national census team is just me and one person that I just hired last week. But the cool thing is that I ran the Hágase Contar campaign in 2010, and I ran all of our Yes Hora civic engagement work. So it's a model by which we work, which is a scalable model. So some of the things that we try to do is, one, make sure that we create informational guides, fact sheets, a lot of the cool census button, swag, et cetera, in a way that's scalable for other groups. We provide that across the country, not in super massive quantities, but in some quantities. So here's the model that we've developed in terms of working more closely with the regions. In 2010, we didn't have the huge issues that we had now, and we also didn't have the same amount of organizations working on this issue. So we were able to provide a pretty good amount of swag and information and actually travel to most of the areas. But now it's a little bit more challenging. So we're doing multiple things. One is we're working in states that don't have any funding. So you know, interestingly to know, the state of Texas passed 0 funding. The state of Florida, 0 funding. There's a couple of other states, I believe Nebraska and some other ones, that have passed no funding for census outreach. So at the state level, there's literally no resources aside from philanthropy. So one of the things that we're doing is we're working with a national philanthropy group. They meet every quarter to go over what are some needs in some areas where we need to dedicate funding to, and that we need to make sure and have at least a small pot of funding. This is not going to be a lot of funding, and it's not going to meet the need of every community, but we're trying the best as possible. So one is through the funding route. 2 is actually looking at what does the local leadership look like in terms of elected officials. So at NALEO, we have a membership of 6,000 Latino elected officials across the country. We've been training them since 2018 on the census, training them not just on what is the census and why it matters, but on how to actually establish complete count committees and how to sway the people in their city council, how to sway people in their school board to pass actual dollars for the census. So we do have a resolution templates. We have a complete count committee template before. We had one before, the Bureau's one is great, and we had one before then, so we just kind of promote both of them now. But making sure that when our elected officials decided to have some leadership in a complete count committee, that it had dollars attached to it, especially in those communities where you had $0. So for example, in Miami-Dade is a good example where we worked closely with one of the school board members, and she was able to pass, again, very slim line item, but it was something compared to 0 at the state level. So that's one piece. So part of it has been, we've been working, providing technical assistance to build the infrastructure for this work. And then the other piece of work that we did, or are doing, is developing turnkey tools, right? So if I'm an organization, and I was just in Kentucky 2 weeks ago, where there were a lot of small organizations and said, hey, we're kind of the only thing in town serving Latinos, and we have no resources. We have very little in-house staff, but we think this work is important. So we've provided them tools, and these are, again, turnkey tools, where they just literally need to plug in the information of the organization and hit print on their printer. And so we've developed a 30-page communications toolkit. We have resources in English and Spanish, but we've made them turnkey in the sense that instead of saying, hey, you're going to go here and then you're going to download this, and then once you download it, these are just, here's a PDF. Print out 100 if you need 100, print out 200 if you need 200. And then if you need to go and work with a small business to get funding to print these materials, here's a template budget on how much it costs. All right, so we have template budgets. We have template budgets on how to do a train the trainer. Again, template resources for resolutions. And then the other big piece of our work has been working closely with our Spanish language media partners. So we have a national partnership with Univision, Telemundo, and Travision. And so one of the things that we do is we just did this mapping last week where we looked at all of their media markets and their affiliates. And we were able to say, here's where we have some presence, here's where we don't, but where we can maybe identify some groups that are there that can do some of the news stories, right? And so we want to make sure and plug in those groups in media markets where we're not at. The other piece that we're doing is we're saying the Census Bureau is going to release their buy plan, their ad buy plan at the end of, it was initially November, I believe now it's December, where we're going to get a sense of all of the buys that they're doing across the country. And so one of the things that we'll be doing with our Spanish language media partners is saying where are the gaps of buys, right? And then we're going to look at, okay, well, now the state is also doing this, right? We're blessed in California in that we have 187 million, but it's not the same in every state. But we want to For us, actually, as Naleo, we're not doing any ad investments in California because it doesn't make sense. There's no gaps, right? And so one of the pieces, the analysis that we'll be doing is looking at where are those gaps for paid media, and then sharing it with our partners and figuring out how do we come in and try to help with Latino communities so that we're investing in a smart way, and sharing it with our funders to see where is the investment needed. And so there's, again, looking at how we provide technical assistance on the infrastructure building. And then on the very practical, we have the handouts, the worksheets, English and Spanish. We do have our partners at Asian Americans Advancing Justice who are translating informational material in about 30 languages. And so we do have access to them as well because it is a national partnership. So whatever, to be very honest, whatever the organization has the need for, we probably already have it. And if we don't, another organization will probably need it, so we'll need to develop it anyways. So that's how I get to travel the country and get a sense of what those needs are and then develop them in a mass scale. But that's in essence how our national infrastructure functions to make sure that we meet the local needs as well as the national.
Great, that's about it for questions. So I want to thank Lizette for her presentation. Thank you so much.